and welcome back. In this video we're going to tackle the excretory system, and in order to do that we're going to have to talk about one of the most important organs that we have in our body, which is the kidney. So first we're going to talk about what makes the kidney so special, so we'll go over some of the anatomy, particularly the nephrons of the kidney, and then we'll look at exactly how the kidney does its job of filtering our blood and making sure that any wastes that we have are excreted as urine. So with that being said, let's get into it. So human beings have two kidneys, and if we look into the anatomy of the kidney, we can see that it's pretty complicated, right? But let's just pay attention to some key parts. So the kidney is responsible for filtering our blood and making sure that any waste products, whether they're either dangerous or just unwanted or unneeded, it makes sure that it gets filtered out as urine. And when we say that the kidney is going to get rid of these metabolic wastes, that means that it can be anything from a byproduct of a cellular reaction to the food that we just digested. And just a brief overview of the kidney's anatomy before we go deeper into it later in the slides. Let's just talk about the general functions of the three important parts of the kidney. So first we have the cortex. The cortex is going to be this uppermost part here, and this is going to be what's responsible for filtering the blood. Then if we move deeper into the kidney, we get into the renal medulla. And the medulla has these little structures here that are called the renal pyramids. And this is where we find structures like nephrons, which are going to regulate the amount of water and salt that we actually have in the filtrate. And then lastly, we have the renal pelvis. And it's going to be this structure here in which the filtrate actually leaves and it gets sent to the bladder eventually. So let's look a little bit deeper into how this process works so that you can know everything you need to know for your test. So the nephron is going to be the functional unit of the kidney. And the functional unit is basically the smallest part of the system that accomplishes the job of that system. So if the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, that means that all of the work that needs to be performed by the kidney at large can be performed in the nephron. Similarly to how the cell is the functional unit of life, all of the processes of life happen in a cell, and life is built off of a building block of its functional units, which are the cell. And this is actually what a nephron looks like. It's this complicated network of tubules. And just imagine that in every single kidney we have approximately 200,000 to 1.8 million nephrons. So that's how the kidney is able to accomplish this huge job, is because they have so many of these working to process our blood. And so we talk a lot about the kidneys filtering our blood, but it's actually a little bit more sophisticated than that. So filtration is the first step, but we also have some other processes that happen as the waste is being concentrated into urine. We also have reabsorption, secretion, and excretion that happens next. So let's talk a little bit more about that, starting with filtration. All filtration means is that we're taking unwanted materials out of the solution. So as blood comes into the kidney in the cortex, it does so via a structure called the afferent arteriole. And that arteriole is going to branch apart into tiny blood vessels called capillaries. And specifically, the capillary bed that exists in the cortex of the kidney is going to be called the glomerulus. And this is where the actual filtration comes into play. Because capillaries are very, very tiny blood vessels, as that arteriole starts to narrow into that capillary bed, large particles like blood cells can't necessarily get through that filter. So in the glomerulus, we have this filtration step happening, and then whatever is able to make it through the glomerulus makes it to the Bowman's capsule. And that's going to be this structure right here. And now the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus together, because they make up that crucial part of the filtration step, they're also called the renal corpuscle. And if we zoom in even further, we can see exactly how this is accomplished. So again, large molecules like blood cells and also proteins are not going to be able to pass through the filter that we have here, as in they do not make it past the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. And we can kind of think of this as a strainer. I personally like to have the mental image of straining pasta, but you can use whatever you like to strain in order to help you remember this. But the cool thing about this straining process is the way in which the body actually accomplishes this. So if we look at this diagram here, we can see that this is a zoomed in version of what's going on in the capillaries of the glomerulus. And as the blood flows through these capillary, we actually have these cell types that wrap around the blood vessel. And that's this yellow mass right here. And those are called podocytes. And they're called podocytes because scientists think they look like little foot-like projections, but they help to filter the blood at these capillary beds in the glomerulus. So as the blood flows through the capillary, we get smaller molecules being able to be filtered out, while the large proteins and blood cells stay within the vessel, as they should, and continue to move throughout the body. And because these little openings are kind of like windows, they're also called fenestrations. Okay, now after filtration, the next step is going to be reabsorption. But let's just take some inventory of how we got here. So first, blood is going to come in through the afferent arteriole and reach the glomerulus. Now, it's important to note that blood is flowing through this circuit here. Blood vessels are interspersed within the nephron, and they tend to run alongside them so that exchange can happen. So after filtration has just happened at the glomerulus and we have the filtrate going into the nephron here, what happens is that the filtrate is going to go through the nephron, and during the reabsorption step, it's going to be exchanging water and salts with the blood vessel that's running alongside of it. And we have a second bed of capillaries called the peritubular capillaries that are going to specifically help with the reabsorption step. The glomerulus does a really good job of filtering, and sometimes we take out too many ions and minerals that we actually do need in the blood. So this reabsorption step at the peritubular capillaries makes sure that any ions and important minerals that were taken out, those are put back into the blood because the body does need to use them. So just a tip to remember the difference between afferent and efferent. If we remember the alphabet and simply the fact that A comes before E alphabetically, then we can remember that the afferent arteriole is going to come before the efferent arteriole in terms of how blood flows into the kidney. Okay, so this is a more accurate example of what the nephron looks like compared to that simplified version before. After we've gotten filtration happening at the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus, reabsorption is actually going to happen throughout the remaining structures of the nephron, so from the proximal convoluted tubule all the way to the collecting duct at the end. However, there are different stages of reabsorption in the nephron. Particularly when we get to the loop of Henle, we're going to find that some structures in this part of the nephron are more permeable to water or are more permeable to salt. So let's talk about it. Zooming in even further, we can now see this U-shaped structure, which is going to be the loop of Henle. And particularly, we're going to talk about the descending limb in this slide. So the descending limb is going to have a high permeability to water and a low permeability to solutes. So by solutes, we mean salts. Anything that is dissolved in water is going to be a solute, making water the solvent. This part of the nephron has a very high permeability to water again, and what this means is that as the filter enters, water is going to be wicked away back into the blood. We can also see this here. And why would that be important? Well, like we said before, we want to make sure that anything the body actually does need is kept, and anything that is truly waste is removed. As the filtrate is passing down the descending limb, any of the material that is currently in there is becoming more concentrated as the water is sucked out. And this is going to lead to water retention for us, right? Because water is being retained back in our blood. As we continue up the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, we're going to see the very opposite. So first we're going to have a very high permeability to salt and a low permeability to water, meaning salt is going to flow out and water is not going to, which we can see here. And when this happens, the filtrate is going to become less concentrated. So before we had water coming out in the descending limb here, and that concentrated the filtrate because there was less water. Well, relatively now, if we remove what was making the filtrate concentrated in the first place, which was all of that solute, all of that salt, then we're going to have it be less concentrated as a result. And this is going to help our body retain the salts that we need. So just to recap briefly, first we had filtration where we took out any large particles that should not be in the waste, like blood cells and proteins. Next we had reabsorption, where in case we have filtered too much in terms of the water and salts that we need, we want to take that back up into the body to make sure that we have that. And then we have secretion. And what secretion means is that you're typically putting one substance into another place. So what kinds of substances would we actually want to put into our waste? Well, these are going to be unwanted substances. So anything that's in the blood that we actually do not want to keep in the body, those substances will be secreted into the nephron of the kidney so they can be taken away outside of the body. So for example, potassium ions, hydrogen ions, this is going to be anything that's kind of acidic, as well as nitrogen waste. So although over 90% of our urine is water, the remaining percentage is mostly made up of uric acid. And secretion is going to take place at both the proximal and distal convoluted tubules. And this is important because anything that we don't need, and especially things that are going to be harmful to us, those substances are taken out of the blood and are actively pushed into waste so that they can be removed. And lastly, we have the process of excretion. So after we have those steps of filtering large particles, reabsorbing necessary ones, and secreting bad particles into the urine, we're going to have excretion. This is the final process by which all of that waste is actually removed. And at this point, we can say that we have urine instead of filtrate. So the very last stop in the nephron is going to be the collecting duct. And from the collecting duct, the urine is transported to the bladder through a ureter. And then the bladder simply stores the urine until it's ready to be expelled, and it is released through the urethra. So in this video, we talked a lot about how the kidney is helpful to the excretory system. Here are just some key things that you should take away. So first, we have to remember that the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, meaning that it's the very smallest unit of the kidney that is able to do the kidney's job. The cortex is going to be the part that filters the blood. The cortex is going to have the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule, which together are the renal corpuscle. And then the medulla is going to have all of those renal pyramids, which contain nephrons. And after filtration, we have absorption, in which the body will reabsorb any water and salt that it may have over-filtered in the previous step. Next, we're going to have the secretion of any toxic or unwanted materials from the blood to the filtrate, and these are going to be examples like hydrogen ions, potassium ions, or nitrogenous urea. And then lastly, we have excretion, in which the final product, which is going to be the urine, is expelled from the body and is stored in the bladder before it is released. Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to wrap up the excretory chapter by talking about a few hormones that are really important for helping to control it. So first, we're going to start out by talking about some multifunctional hormones that we also see in the endocrine chapter. And these are going to be examples like the parathyroid hormones, like PTH itself. And we're also going to talk a little bit about some pituitary hormones like ADH. And next, we're going to talk about some more excretory specific hormones like the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, as well as a little hormone called ANP. So with that being said, let's get into it. The parathyroid gland secretes two hormones that are primarily responsible for balancing calcium homeostasis in the body. So these are going to be hormones like parathyroid hormone, as well as calcitonin. So let's first consider what each of these hormones do. Now, PTH, or parathyroid hormone, is going to be responsible for raising blood calcium levels. So calcium is really important for certain cellular processes, and there are times where we're going to need more calcium in the blood to support those cellular processes. So in these situations, we're going to have PTA release. And what PTH does is that it's going to raise blood calcium levels. And the way that it accomplishes this does involve the kidney. So the very first way that we get calcium back into the blood is that we get it reabsorbed in the nephrons of our kidneys. So sometimes the nephron is going to over-filter some substances, and we want to take those substances back into the body in a process called reabsorption. And calcium reabsorption happens in the nephron, especially when PTH is the one that is calling for that reabsorption. But another way to increase blood calcium levels is to literally just take it from the biggest calcium stores that we have, which are our bones. So that's going to be the other way. Now, calcitonin is going to be the very opposite of parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin is going to tone down blood calcium levels. And the way that calcitonin works is that it's just going to do the opposite of PTH. So if PTH is going to promote calcium reabsorption, calcitonin is going to promote calcium to leave the body. It's going to tell the nephrons to hold off on reabsorbing it. Same thing with the storage in the bones. If PTH is going to have calcium liberated from the bones, calcitonin is then going to cause calcium to be stored by the bones. And a big question that I had when I was learning this is, what does calcium have to do with kidney function? Like, it makes sense to talk about the cardiovascular system when it comes to the kidneys, right? Because the kidneys are influencing fluid balance, and fluid balance ultimately influences blood pressures. But calcium reabsorption in the kidney is actually a lot more important than we might think. So while parathyroid is making sure that calcium is getting reabsorbed in the nephrons of the kidneys, it expressly makes sure that calcium is absorbed while keeping phosphate ions out of the blood. So the phosphate ions are going to be the ones that are going to pass into the filtrate and become urine, whereas the calcium ions are taken back up into the blood. And this is because of some simple chemistry. If the calcium were to be reabsorbed alongside the phosphate, they would react to form a salt that would then get lodged in the kidney. And this is called a kidney stone. Now, kidney stones are made up of different materials sometimes, but you can get calcium-based ones. And this is the mechanism that is thought to cause these calcium-based kidney stones is when they come together with phosphate during this process. Okay, now ADH is going to be another key player when it comes to the excretory system. This is going to be a hormone that is produced in the hypothalamus, but is released through the posterior pituitary. And basically, an antidiuretic is something that is going to prevent urine production. Diuretic is going to promote, An antidiuretic is going to prevent. And the way that ADH works is that when the body is in a state of dehydration or it needs to conserve water, it's going to accomplish this by reabsorbing all of the water that it can from the blood that's being filtered. And what happens in the kidney is that we get the insertion of water channels that are called aquaporins. And these aquaporins get inserted into the collecting duct within the nephron. And this provides opportunities for water to be reabsorbed back into the blood. ADH is also known by another name. It's called vasopressin. And a good way to remember what ADH/vasopressin does is to remember that vasopressin is going to suppress the urge to urinate. Now, a very key system that we have in regulating our blood volume is going to be the renin-angiotensin system. And these are just the names of the enzymes and hormones that will be recruited within this process. So let's go through it step by step. Now, within the kidney, we have the functional units of the nephrons. And at the beginning of the nephron, we have this structure called the glomerulus, which is responsible for much of the filtration that happens in the kidney. Now, if we consider what a glomerulus looks like, at the very beginning of a nephron, we can see the juxtaglomerular cells here. And juxtaglomerular cells are simply just going to be cells that are next to the glomerulus. That's what the prefix juxta means. And what these cells do is that they produce renin in response to changes in blood pressure, particularly when blood pressure or blood volume is low. So a lot of time in our cells and in the body at large, we have a lot of enzymes that are basically sitting around waiting to be activated. And this is where renin comes in. Renin is going to be an enzyme that activates the molecule angiotensinogen. And it's going to activate it into its intermediary form, which is angiotensin 1. And then a second enzyme called ACE is going to come in and transform angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And ACE just stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. Now, this is a pretty convoluted process just to get from angiotensinogen to angiotensin 2. But it does help to know that angiotensin 1 does not have any biological activity. Its only role is to serve as a precursor to angiotensin 2. Now, angiotensin 2 is actually a peptide hormone, so it's going to be a hormone that is going to be responsible for correcting that low fluid balance. So first, it can stimulate aldosterone release. And aldosterone is a type of hormone. It's called a mineralocorticoid, and it's responsible for increasing blood volume. And we'll talk about how in the next slide. Angiotensin 2 is also going to increase sodium reabsorption. So in the nephron, we do have specialized areas that are responsible for absorbing either water or salt. And those are going to be in the loop of Henle. But what angiotensin 2 is going to do is it's going to promote sodium reabsorption in the proximal tubule of the nephron. So this is going to be even before it reaches the loop of Henle. And this is to ensure that water will be absorbed back into the blood, because what happens is that the water is going to follow the salt. So by putting more solute in the blood, there's less water, and the water is going to want to go in as substances diffuse from high to low concentration. Angiotensin 2 is also a good vasoconstrictor. So a really good way to raise your blood pressure is to make the vessels physically smaller. This is going to increase the pressure that the existing liquid is going to have if the vessels themselves are smaller, as opposed to simply increasing the volume of the blood to kind of match the size of the vessel. And because constricting blood vessels is going to increase blood pressure, it's also going to increase something called TPR, which stands for total peripheral resistance. And this is basically the amount of force that the heart has to overcome in order to pump blood throughout the body, because the resistance is going to be the resistance of the blood in flowing through a smaller vessel. And something that we're all familiar with is that angiotensin 2 is just going to make you thirsty. So an easy way to increase blood pressure or blood volume is to simply put more fluid in your blood. And the best way to do that is to just drink some water. Now here we're going to talk a little bit more about what aldosterone does, just because it is an important hormone that you will need to know what it looks like. It's a steroid hormone that's going to be produced by our adrenal gland, and the way that it actually helps to increase blood pressure and blood volume is that it causes more salt and water to be reabsorbed. And at the same time, it makes sure that potassium is secreted. So you can kind of think of aldosterone as like a bouncer in a way. You know, it's letting sodium and water in, but it's keeping potassium out. And when I say in, I mean it's letting it back into the blood. And lastly, we have something called atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. And this is going to be kind of where the heart is involved in this process. So again, the excretory system is going to be important not just for getting rid of waste, but regulating fluid balance and blood pressure. So the way that ANP works is that they're going to be secreted by atrial cells. So These are going to be the cells that are located in the atria of the heart. And what happens is that when blood pressure is actually too high, the atrial cells are going to feel too much mechanical stretch. So if the atrial cells are experiencing too much force because of high blood pressure, what they'll do is they'll send some signals to lower it down. And here's the way it does this. One, it's going to increase the glomerular filtration rate. So it's basically just going to ramp up kidney function so that it can clear liquid faster. Again, we're going to see the importance of sodium reabsorption. So ANP is going to decrease sodium reabsorption, meaning that the water is not going to follow the salt in this case. So if we're not bringing salt into the blood, the water won't come. And at the same time, it's going to increase sodium excretion. So we're making sure that no sodium is going to come back into the blood and possibly raise the blood pressure. In this case, we want it to be lower, so we want to excrete the sodium. And lastly, it's going to inhibit the RAS system. So the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, that's not happening because that whole process is meant to increase blood pressure. So we're going to inhibit that to make sure that the pressure doesn't raise into dangerous levels that could then damage the cells in the heart. So in this video, we learned that a lot of the excretory process is regulated by a handful of hormones, both hormones that are specific to the adrenal system, as well as hormones that are multifunctional elsewhere in the endocrine system. Just some of the key things that we talked about that are unique to the excretory system will be the peptide hormones in the renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone system. So we're going to have to remember that that is responsible for raising blood pressure when it's low. And then we also have the atrial natriuretic peptide, which is basically a way for the heart to sense when it needs to tell the excretory system to lower the pressure. And so something that I thought about when I was looking through this chapter is, why are there so many hormones that are dedicated to managing excretory function? And you can take a moment to think about it for your own, but just to think about how important excretion is, not just for eliminating waste and harmful substances, but also for balancing fluid. And because fluid is basically what keeps us alive, and we got blood pressure, it's going to affect other organs and their abilities to do their jobs. If we take the heart, for example, if the heart is experiencing too much high blood pressure, then it can't possibly function. It'll instead get damaged. And so because the kidneys have such an important job, but at the same time they're working together with all of the other organ systems that we have,